Madam President and members, as many of us may remember, last year was a little contentious over some of the decisions made by the Minnesota High School League. In those decisions in fall as well as early spring, they made a policy decision to include transgender students into sport teams that may be of their opposite birth sex when a student considers themselves to be something other than how they were born. The amendment before us focuses on a major issue regarding that whole discussion, and that is there seems to be an ambiguity in the decision regarding the Minnesota High School League, and that's what to do with students that think this way about themselves, but how do we create the policy when it comes to the use of locker rooms or bathrooms in our public schools? This particular amendment, A75, would simply recognize that when a student, regardless of how they think of themselves, that the birth sex would dictate to them the appropriate bathroom, locker room, or any other changing room, shower room that would be used. This seems to be an ambiguity in our rules that the Minnesota High School League has created, and this is to give direction in law to that policy. Madam Chair, I will stand for any questions that may come up.
Is there any discussion on the A75 amendment? Senator Uyghur.
Yes, thank you, Madam President. I oppose the amendment. There's a couple of letters being distributed, one from the organization representing principals in the schools throughout the state of Minnesota, expressing that there is not a problem that the legislation or the amendment seeks to address. There's another handout, I believe, from the Department of Human Rights, and one as well from the Civil Liberties Union. This was a late introduction. I believe the bill maybe was right before the committee deadline, and for the reasons stated in the letters, I oppose the bill.
Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Madam President. I also would oppose the A75 amendment. Madam President, members, a few points. These bathroom surveillance bills are unnecessary. They're unenforceable. They encourage discrimination, and they would expose our schools quite clearly to civil liability. Madam President, these bills are inappropriate involvement by government in our daily life. There is no need for the legislature to interfere with students using restrooms. And school administrators need flexibility in order to ensure that all students are protected, have a safe learning environment. This bill mandates a one-size-fits-all approach, and it actually undermines school safety. There have been no verified incidents of bathroom harassment. Laws against any sort of disruptive or criminal behavior in bathrooms already exist. 17 states, including Minnesota, more than 225 cities across the U.S., have passed and successfully implemented non-discrimination laws. None have experienced any sorts of incidents that this proposal might suggest are feared. Washington, D.C., Colorado, Connecticut, Hawaii, Iowa, Maine, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Nevada, New Mexico, Oregon, Rhode Island, Vermont. And all of these states have been asked, have any problems occurred, and all have reported absolutely none. So how would we even enforce such a law? This is an unenforceable proposal. We can't ask schools to police bathrooms. What would we do? Have teachers posted at the doors and verify someone's chromosomes or other aspects of their physical characteristics. It would open schools to liability because they conflict with federal non-discrimination requirements, places schools in a terrible position in conflict with state and federal laws. Would we ask students to have IDs or medical documents just to use the bathroom? Or, like I said, testing chromosomes? But, Madam President, most insidious of all, this would encourage the additional scrutiny on people who look different and encourage our schools to single students out based on which bathroom they use. Transgender and gender nonconforming young people are already at much, much greater risk for harassment, discrimination, being pushed out of the schools, and this only goes to further stigmatize vulnerable students. Madam President, these are our children. Transgender people are a part of everyday American life. Instead of ostracizing our own children, we should embrace people and ensure all are safe and can live their daily lives without harassment. Consider this, nearly 9 in 10 transgender students have been verbally harassed at school due to their gender expression. More than half have been physically assaulted. This bill would only lead to more of that. 15% of transgender people report being forced to leave an educational program due to harassment and discrimination. This bill encourages further pushing people out rather than protecting them or increasing their privacy. Madam President, for 25 years, the courts have interpreted sex discrimination as offering protection to those who do not conform to gender stereotypes or expectations, including transgender people. Title IX bars sex discrimination in education. The Department of Education advises that this also includes discrimination against transgender students. Refusing to allow a transgender student to use a restroom that matches their gender identity constitutes sex discrimination. To the extent that a public school attempts such an action, the district is potentially susceptible to challenge under the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause. Districts barring transgender students from using the restroom that matches their gender identity, transgender students and no others would be compelled to disclose information that is very private. The Minnesota Department of Human Rights has already found that such a practice is impermissibly discriminatory. Madam President, maybe we need to spend a moment really understanding that transgender boys are boys, transgender girls are girls. Madam President, I would ask the members of this body to spend some time and get to know members of our community with whom we might not be familiar. Understand that some people are born in a way that is different. Their brains are different than what their bodies might be. This is not a matter of choice. And some move through the world and present themselves in the way that conforms to who they are, what their gender identity is. So, Madam President, transgender students should not bear the brunt of others' discomfort. Schools should make the effort to talk with all students and work through concerns. Schools should have private facilities available for any students who wish to use them. School districts around our state and around the nation have implemented those policies. They've done so very successfully. So, Madam President, this is not a good idea. This solves no problem and creates untold problems for young people who are already struggling with issues of self-esteem, of belonging, of stigma, of discrimination. This does nothing to help our Minnesota students, transgender or otherwise. So please vote against the A75.
Senator Benson.
Thank you, Madam President. And I think we need to think about all the students who are in this situation. Little girl in 4th grade, a boy she's been going to kindergarten with, or has been going to school with since kindergarten, and in 5th grade, someone she knew as a boy comes back as a girl. She might be a little uncomfortable. She's starting to go through some changes in her life. She is facing some challenges, and now someone she has known her whole life is different, and maybe she can't figure that out. Because while we are adults and we can have empathy, she is a child, and maybe she's nervous, and maybe she would just like to be in a bathroom with girls, and this would let her do that. This is not about what Senator Dibble addressed, the children who are transgender. This is about all the children being heard, understanding that not everybody is going to be as comfortable as Senator Dibble would like them to be. But elementary school students, junior high students, even high school students of all types are going through some tough times, and this allows somebody to say, can I just be in a locker room with people who I know are girls?
Senator Rude.
Madam President and members, I rise in support of this amendment. And I think if you read the amendment, the very first statement is what this is all about. The purpose of this section is to protect and provide for the privacy and safety of all students. And I think that's a very important point. And as we want our children to be safe when we send them off to school, I think this provides that for all students, whatever their orientation is. And I think that's the main purpose of this, is to protect and provide safety for all of our children.
Senator Gazelka.
Thank you, Madam President, members, and Senator Dibble. I appreciate, Senator Dibble, that you are standing up for folks, whether they're transgenders or gays or lesbians or others. I do appreciate that you want to be a voice, that you want to stand up. I appreciate that. But as we wrestle with the complexities of transgender sexual identity here in this body, we cannot forget all students and every situation. And we want to make sure that all students have their privacy kept and all students are looked out for their safety in all schools, all public schools. And so we have to wrestle with that and at the same time look at everyone. And I fail to believe that it's inappropriate and unenforceable to say that boys use boys' bathrooms and showers and girls use girls' bathrooms and showers. We've been doing that for a long time. That by itself is not going to protect every person in every situation, but we do have clear guidelines. Biological boys who identify as girls should not share locker rooms and bathrooms and showers with biological girls. That's just common sense. But at the same time, we should not forget each one of these individual students, no matter who they are, no matter what their identity is, and look out for them.
Senator Marty.
Madam President, I want to point out the letter again from the secondary school principals and elementary school principals about how they've been dealing with these issues and taking care of it fine. And Senator Benson, I understand how a fourth grader may not understand this. I grew up in an age where we didn't have any students with physical or mental or developmental disabilities in our classrooms because we kept them hidden away. And back in those days, if you'd see somebody with a disability come into the classroom, people didn't know how to deal with it. They were different. They were different people. And that's a very real part of society, and we've learned in the past 30, 40 years how wrong it was to isolate people like that. Because when we live together, we learn to get along together, we understand differences. And for a transgender student, as Senator Dibble pointed out, they're the ones who are suffering the most. They're the ones who are the most pain, the most bullied, the most harassed, physically assaulted. And yes, it's hard for them and it's hard for their classmates, but that's part of growing up. And I think that's what teachers, and that's why I want to point to what the principals are saying. The schools are able to deal with this without legislative intervention. And yes, none of us understand people who are in different shoes, in a different situation. Heterosexual folks don't understand same-sex urges. Transgender folks don't understand what it's like for the rest of us, and we don't understand what life is like for them. And I think the idea is fourth graders can learn. Somebody's different than them, but this transgender girl is still a girl. They can learn to understand that. And kindergarten teachers can teach this. People of every age can learn from it, and that's what I think if you look back 3 or 4 decades in the way we treated people with various types of disabilities, we thought of them in terrible ways. And by incorporating that into the classroom, into the learning experience, and recognizing that we have the capacity to understand people who are different, I think the same thing happens here. There are differences in people here. But to say that we as a legislature have to determine who is male and who is female and who can use what locker room, I think if this was a huge problem needing an answer, I think we'd have the principals coming in and saying the opposite, but they're saying they are handling it fine and we don't need to intervene, and I urge us not to intervene in something that's working fine.
Senator Eaton. Senator Latz.
Madam President and members, those of us who are in the minority have experienced being a little uncomfortable in different settings not of our choosing. And I understand how a little fourth grade girl might feel a little uncomfortable. It seems to me that would pale in comparison to the feelings of a transgender child who feels a lot uncomfortable, who's excluded, who's isolated, who's condemned, who's subjugated, who's bullied, who may be physically attacked. Indeed, who's at risk here? Where is the safety issue? The safety issue is not for the 95, 98, 99% of the children who are not transgender. The safety issue is for the one who stands out as different. And kids can be cruel. The only way kids are going to learn to not lash out physically and emotionally at people who are different is to be with them, to understand them, and to learn to accept them. Should we just leave this decision up to the majority of the kids? History teaches us that the majorities would willingly vote to isolate, condemn, discriminate in law and in fact against those who are not the majority. We ought not to repeat those mistakes of history. My daughter has a friend, and she comments every now and then that her friend has 2 moms. And she doesn't say that in any way other than observing the difference, curiosity, about the difference between our own family. She says it without shock and dismay, but because she's discussed it, has been exposed to it, leads to understanding and acceptance. So I stand with Senator Dibble and Senator Marty and those of us who would not take the step proposed by this amendment. And I stand with the Minnesota State High School League, which spent months working on this issue and reached a consensus that this matter is best left at the local level, local control. Local control. We've heard this on this floor many times. So here's our opportunity to vote consistently with the belief that local control is the appropriate way to deal with some of these issues. I encourage members to vote against this amendment.
Senator Hall.
Thank you, Madam President and members. I'm thinking about my granddaughters as we think about this bill. I think all students need to be considered. I appreciate Senator Dibble's heart in this. I thought it was really good the other evening. I watched Bruce Jenner explain who he was and the process that he had to go through. And my heart really went out to him and to the transgenders that is a hard situation. I can't even imagine, and I certainly can't understand. But for my granddaughters at 8 years old or whatever, 9 years old they are, to be in a locker room and have a boy walk in that believes he's a girl, you know, I feel for him. But what about all my granddaughters or your children or the children of Minnesota that are going to see him nude and that's okay? Are we going to bathrooms that, you know, are, and I should say my granddaughter. What about me when I go to if I were to go to the YMCA and they were going to say, well, now we're letting anybody go into any locker room, no matter what you are, and I have a female walk in to the showers where I'm nude and they're nude. Would I not feel uncomfortable? Would you not feel uncomfortable? And yet we're going to do that to our children? God, I have a really hard time with that. And I understand we want to try to accept people for who they are. I think that's important. Try not to judge them for who they are. They're going through a process like I'm going through a process. But to put the children that we're here to protect, and granted we're here to protect all children, I think we're putting them in a very dangerous, because mentally they're not ready. Folks, I'm not ready mentally. I don't understand it mentally. It would be hard for me. I would walk out of a locker room like that. And yet, we're asking our children not to do that, but to accept. I think it's a very hard situation we're putting our kids into. And I think we can learn some of those things in the classroom, the differences that are out there, but I don't think we should be learning those things in the locker room or the bathroom. And granted, bathrooms have stalls, so it's going to be a little different there. But do you kind of get what I'm talking about? So I would vote for this amendment. I think I just think it's right.
Senator Dibble.
Madam President, the purpose statement cited earlier is a great purpose statement. The purpose of this section is to protect and provide for the privacy and safety of all students. Except it fails in that fundamental purpose that it states for itself. Madam President, it creates a less safe circumstance Imagine how a young person who is a girl, but might have been identified differently at their birth, is going to feel knowing about this discussion on the floor of the Minnesota Senate. Somehow they're worthy of being marginalized, stigmatized, ostracized, and treated differently. Imagine if that girl is being told they have to walk into a boys' bathroom. Imagine the response of the student body in those circumstances. Members, you heard it on the floor. There's a lack of understanding and familiarity with transgender people. There's an expression, ignorance equals fear, fear equals discrimination. Members, please look into your hearts. Think about those young people. They're human beings. They feel deeply. Their parents love and care about them and fear for them every single day that they send them to school. Yes, there's discomfort. There's discomfort with lots of things as we grow up and learn that the world is different than what we know is true inside our own families. We meet people who are vastly different from us in many ways, especially in a pluralistic society like ours. People from other countries and other religions and other value systems and political beliefs. And we negotiate that terrain and we figure it out. Members, this will not accomplish the goals that are set forth because it immediately goes into defining something that is untrue. Sex means the physical condition of being male or female, which is determined by a person's chromosomes and is identified at birth by a person's anatomy. That is a false statement on its face, and it closes eyes and ears and hearts to the scientific, medical, and lived reality of people's lives. Citizens of the state of Minnesota are children. Understand and read and educate yourself about who and what transgender people are, the reality of their lives. It is a profound and persistent identification as a member of the other sex. Persons might become aware of having a gender identity that is not typical for a member of their sex at any age. A person's gender identity is linked to physical characteristics of a person's brain. Gender identity is not a matter of choice or amenable to change. So to simply make a statement like this is to simply exclude by legislation the reality of people, students attending our schools, and it puts them in danger of what we already know to be true in greater percentages, the amount of discrimination, harm, physical violence, poor academic outcomes. This does nothing to help any child, transgender or otherwise, in Minnesota. Please do not support the A75.
Is there any more discussion? Senator Ortman.
Thank you, Madam President. This amendment makes me incredibly sad because it targets so very few Minnesotans. And it's really unfortunate. I don't believe that a state law is necessary to address this issue. It's been pointed out by senators in this body that our principals feel confident that they can handle these issues on a case-by-case basis. And they have elected officials that they are accountable to, our school boards, that also have an election certificate. And so, members, I will be voting no on this amendment because I believe the principals in our schools and the faculty in our schools have the best interests of all students at heart. And I have seen firsthand how these principals have worked to deal with these cases on a case-by-case basis. I had an instance in my family very close to me of bullying, and I saw an assistant principal meet with the family members on both sides of the problem and work out solutions. Those are good things that happen in our high schools when those principals and teachers work out some of these challenging situations and those affected can learn by them. We don't need broad sweeping legislation. We need to encourage those conversations because we live in a world that is changing. And I have been affected so much by the students that come to this Capitol year after year after year and say, please accept us and our friends for who we are. I'm learning from them. I'm grateful for their visits here, and I will be voting no on this amendment. I encourage members to be brave and vote no and allow our schools, our principals, our families, and our school boards to handle these issues as appropriately.
Senator Johnson.
Madam President and members, I too oppose this amendment. And I'm reading the material that was handed out by Senator Uyghur from the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. And in the fourth paragraph, it says, the second issue is that given how this amendment defines sex, it could exclude certain students with chromosomal disorders. I have had personal experience with that in our family. That person, because of chromosomes, was defined as a gender because they did a test in the hospital. That has probably happened to many people that wasn't found out early enough. And we have a situation here where it's not that someone tried to do something to themselves, it's their chromosomes. And we talk about not being accustomed to, seeing other people's bodies. But that reminds me of myself when it was a trip that we made to actually Russia and to Yugoslavia, and we went to Dubrovnik. And it was the first time that I saw men and women nude at the pool in their fancy resorts. It was very unusual for me. But we can learn, we can get accustomed to that. People are very tolerant, as Senator Latt said. We get, when children are taught in a respectful way of what is going on, they can accept it. They will accept it. But I go back to this paragraph and it says, chromosomal disorders. There is a difference between men and women, but there's a lot of people who, I think of it myself and I say, there are many of us females who are very feminine, and there are those who are not so feminine. And there are men who are not so, I don't know, I don't even want to say a word that offends anyone, but I don't mean to offend anyone when I say some men are rather macho and others are more kind of tender. And I think of them as kind of toward, kind of like women, because I think of women as generally being more tender. Again, it's just my perception. But let's keep in mind that it's chromosomes that affects this.
Is there any more discussion? Senator Limmer.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President and members, I appreciate the calm character of our discussion. I appreciate the respectful interplay that we've had back and forth. But in closing this discussion, I would like to make a few comments. I believe that gay and transgendered kids should be protected, should be safe at our schools, and they should be respected. as any and all of our children should be. The Minnesota High School League, not us, is the ones who intervened in writing public policy. This rather low functionary organization of state government assigned to look over the rules of how our kids interact with their sport teams are the ones that are writing the policy that, if we do nothing, are the ones who write state policy. There's other government agencies that are beginning to recognize that in their own discussions and writings as late as this week. If the system was working as we've been asked to believe, that school principals and school districts have figured this all out, why did the High School League have to write a policy at all if it was working? I don't have the answer to that. They've never given any direction of why they needed to write a policy when there's been people on this floor that have said it's working anyway. But I want us to think about one thing. I believe, and I think Minnesota parents believe, that biological female students should not have to worry about a biological man, young man, sharing their locker room or bathroom. Nor should our daughters be put in the position of sharing a locker room or a bathroom with a bunch of adolescent young men. I believe schools should not be a place for social engineering. I believe, and I think you should ask yourself the question, should biological boys who identify as girls be able to share bathrooms and lockers with biological girls? That's what this issue is about. It's not about whether we're going to allow certain kids to play on specific biological sex teams like has already been discussed. We're talking about the use of facilities designed for locker rooms, bathrooms, places to undress. Do students have a right to privacy? All students, do they have a right to privacy in those facilities, or do they not? Apparently there's a few here that say they do not deserve privacy. I'm kind of surprised we're even having this discussion, Madam President and members. And I think that policy making like this belongs in the House and Senate floor, not in the offices of the Minnesota High School League. This is government policy. It should be decided by those who represent the public and not by a functionary of the administration. So I'm asking you to participate in the role of governing that you have been elected to conduct. Do you believe that locker rooms of your daughters be shared with biological men? It's as simple as that. Madam Chair, I think my question, or I think I'm done. If anyone has any other questions, I'll stand.
Is there any more discussion? Secretary will take the roll on the A75 amendment. All members having voted, the Secretary will close the roll. There being 25 ayes and 40 nays, the motion does not prevail. The amendment is not adopted.